The Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties, and their potential for protecting Arctic resources and cultures. In this session, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, what is it? Liz Karan, Director of Ocean Governance at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and Dr. Troy Bouffard, Director of the Arctic Security Program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, discuss the treaty and its implications.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of the Juneau World Affairs Council and our hosts at KTOO, thank you for having us again. Last night was amazing. I see many of you have returned. We have a new fresh topic for you today that is related to UNCLOS, and I think we're going to enjoy this. This morning, I'm joined by Liz Karan from the Pew Charitable Trust. She has been working on this treaty since 2016. I'd venture to say she is probably the leading expert in the United States on this. So we've talked, and we've decided that she's going to lead this morning's discussion and tell you how this treaty works from beginning to end globally, and I'm going to try to bring some elements of how this is important to Alaska. So, Liz, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you very much to the Juneau World Affairs Council for inviting me to speak today about this exciting development in international law and marine conservation. As Troy mentioned, I'm Liz Karan. I lead the ocean governance portfolio at the Pew Charitable Trusts based in Washington, D.C., which includes Pew's work to advocate on a new treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, what we call BBNJ. Pew has been engaged in this work since 2012, 2013, and I've been leading Pew's program on this issue since 2016, as Troy mentioned. So a little ground setting, the treaty scope covers the high seas and ocean areas beyond national jurisdiction. Those are areas that fall outside of a country's exclusive economic zone, which is typically 200 nautical miles from the shore. They make up roughly 2/3 of the world's global ocean and cover almost half of the planet's surface. These areas are rich in biodiversity and home to unique ecosystems and species. Due to the extreme depths of the ocean, these waters in the deep seabed make up 95% of the livable area on Earth. The high seas provides direct economic benefits and ecosystem services, including natural carbon uptake and storage, estimated at over $200 billion per year. But the health of the ocean is declining due to pollution, overfishing, and climate change. As a result, countries first took up this issue at the international level in 2002, and after 20 years concluded an agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. While deriving from UNCLOS, the treaty is open to all UN member countries, and it is not a requirement to ratify UNCLOS to join this treaty. So similar to the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which the US has ratified. During the negotiations, countries were keen that the intent was not to duplicate or replace UNCLOS, but rather to provide a focused instrument to better implement the provisions in UNCLOS related more specifically to the protection of the marine environment and encouraging marine scientific research. As a result, in 2011, countries agreed upon a package of elements that the new BBNJ agreement would address. Those package elements are listed here. They include area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, access and benefit sharing derived from the utilization of marine genetic resources, and capacity building and technology, transfer of marine technology. It was further agreed at that time that the negotiations had to address these topics together and as a whole. So basically trying to have equity and parity amongst these treaty elements. So I'll quickly go through the different elements one by one. Area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So this part of the agreement was to creates a legal framework for establishing a network of high seas marine protected areas. Currently, only around 1% of the high seas is protected in areas like the Southern Ocean around Antarctica and the Northeast Atlantic, where there are regional agreements that provide the legal framework to do so. But for the rest of the high seas, there really hasn't been this the possibility to create high seas protected areas. The treaty also recognizes indigenous people and local communities may have relevant traditional knowledge to contribute to areas beyond national jurisdiction and the conservation management. And it includes for their participation in the consultation process of these area-based management tools. Environmental impact assessments. This part of the treaty sets consistent standards and process for assessing impacts of new and unregulated human activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction to avoid, mitigate, and manage significant adverse impacts. Greater transparency when an activity is conducted within national jurisdiction and may have effects on the high seas. So it can also apply to new and unregulated activities within national jurisdiction. And processes for scientific review and support for developing countries' participation. This last provision is really about level setting and helping to bring other countries' environmental impact assessment standards and processes in line with global best practice, much of which the US is already a leader in. The marine genetic resources part aims to balance the freedoms of marine scientific research with fair and equitable sharing of benefits, provides for monetary and non-monetary benefits derived from the commercial utilization of marine genetic resources to further the objective of conservation and sustainable use of the high seas and areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is one of the more contentious issues in the negotiation because of the benefit sharing provision. But it was a key breakthrough in getting the treaty concluded and over the line. And it establishes a notification system for scientific sharing and also to monitor implementation. Oh, sorry, I think I went one too fast. There we go. So the capacity building and transfer of marine technology provision really focuses on enabling and assisting effective implementation of the agreement. It provides for country-driven needs assessments that can be implemented at the national, regional, or global levels. It sets up access to new funding sources. And again, this is really critical to developing countries so that they have the necessary resources to fully engage in this agreement. So what does this mean for ocean conservation and sustainable use? Well, you can see with the map here, there's no lack of international treaties and multilateral bodies that exist in the high seas and manage parts of the ocean space. But it's a fragmented array of organizations that manage different aspects of human activities, for example, fisheries or mining or shipping, or relating to different geographic areas in the high seas with varying degrees of effectiveness. And they don't do a great job of coordinating with each other. So really, the BBNJ treaty now requires countries to ensure better cooperation and coordination within and amongst these organizations towards the objective of conservation and sustainable use. And the goal towards being able to play an important role of implementing international commitments, including those in the Global Biodiversity Framework and Sustainable Development Goals. The BBNJ Treaty, last count, I think just over 75 countries have ratified, so it has met the threshold to enter into force. and it will enter into force on January 17th, 2026. In the meantime, countries at the UN have continued their discussions to prepare for the treaty's entry into force, primarily along these three elements. Making sure that the institutional mechanisms are in place for the implementation of the agreement, building up science capacity for better conservation and management tools of the ocean, and really trying to make sure that when the January 2026 date comes forward, that the treaty will be able to meet the objectives that countries have agreed to. And I'll end there and hand back to Troy. Thank you. I don't know if you'd like to take questions now, or also happy to wait to the end.
We'll probably wait until after I'll get through a few slides, and then we'll invite the audience to come up with questions. So thank you very much, Liz, for that overview. As you can see, this is globally very important. And what we need to take away from this is happening very quick. We need to be very excited about this treaty. Unlike UNCLOS and all the discussions we had yesterday, we're in a fight in terms of trying to get that ratified for the United States, okay? But this treaty is new, it's separate. We can ratify it separately from UNCLOS, and it complements other existing treaties, right? This one's moving very quickly. There's a reason it's getting ratified so quick. This is a great treaty. This covers down on all the ecosystem areas where UNCLOS couldn't, and other areas too. So, are my slides up? Good deal. I'm going to cover some aspects of why this is important to Alaska, why we need to get behind this very quickly, advocate, speak to this, and talk about how special this is for Alaska. This is going to give us tools, very important tools that we need. Quick agenda, I'm going to cover some key areas. These are a bit text dense, but I wanted to get as much out there as possible. While I'm talking, you can read. As Liz mentioned, the key thing about this, if you remember anything, are the area-based management tools. This is the mechanism where interested parties, nationally, regionally, indigenous, otherwise, can pursue a mechanism to do something. This is what this treaty does. It helps to establish area-based management tools, which there are plenty of. There's many of them that cover areas that already exist in the maritime world, right? Particular sensitive sea areas, marine protected areas, all of these things that exist already are in good practice and work well. These apply. This treaty brings together this thing known as area-based management tools. We want to affect behavior somewhere in the maritime region. You apply for an ABMT. Right, this is the key, this is the tool, and there's a good process for this I'll show you at the end. Right? There are many connections to Alaska here that are important, and everyone here knows how much help we need in protecting our ecosystem. Domain awareness, the work that NOAA does, the science, understanding our environment is still one of the harder things to do. When those salmon leave those rivers and they're out in open waters, we don't know well enough what's happening when they come back, and the numbers don't match what we're expecting. And if they come back, they're moving north, they're going to places where indigenous leaders and peoples have no name for these things. Right? Things are changing very rapidly. As we know, we're seeing these changes faster than other places in the world. So we need this tool now, and we need to convince our leaders to adopt this as soon as possible. So we're part of this from day one when it goes into force in January. Right? It can give all of our authorities who help to manage these things right now in the ways that they do and the mechanisms they have, more power, more ways to work with others to establish these areas, area-based management tools. One of the things you can do is recommend different routes for ships to move around protected areas for whatever reason. Right? There are very powerful tools in this. These are already in practice, but falling under this new framework gives them extra power and meaning. This will only help science. If we have a purpose on why and how to study an area that should be protected, we can now do it with more purpose. Everyone here knows this, and UAS down here in Juneau and other organizations are leaders in this. This will also give our authorities ways to help manage potential bad actors, criminals, and others that we talked about yesterday. Right? The reason we need to protect areas not just from our own seemingly benign human activity, this helps us get at the deliberate bad actors also. Intelligence is huge. It's not something we think about a lot, but understanding our environment, our maritime environment, so our authorities have the right information that can be synthesized into intelligence for action, is part of a world you may or may not be familiar with. If you've served in the military and you're part of organizations, you know what this means. This can get stuff done very fast. This can help feed that. So a couple more key points here I want you to know. Why this is so important for the United States and Alaska. My colleague, Dr. Larry Hinsman, one of the lead authorities in Alaska on supporting such efforts, he had a tour of in the OSTP of the White House. And for a short time when I was in DC in the Senate office also, we collaborated in different ways, but Dr. Hinsman was instrumental in getting this memo passed in the White House as guidance to federal agencies on how indigenous ways of knowing is legitimate evidence that must be used in decision making and knowledge creation. And this references several executive orders that are in power, but there's about 48 pages of here how this has to be done. Indigenous ways of knowing is not just a phrase, right? It goes side by side with Western science and is legitimate evidence. Put two and two together, you know where I'm going with this. We work together, we have the power as Alaskans to help shape how the environment should be protected through this new treaty, and using all of our knowledge to make that happen, right? It's required to be recognized by any agency that might support why we should establish an area-based management tool, right? And I think there are many of us out there just ready to do that right now with what exists and what else do we need to do to make this happen. If we had a process that made it easier to protect our environment, I think we're ready. We're all for it. So as Liz mentioned, establishing ABMT, sorry for the typo there, is 5 steps, and this is straight out of the UN process. Not too difficult to deal with, right? These are legitimate steps that are provide due diligence and good inclusivity, but get the job done, right? So I think international institutions understand that we got to make things simpler. It already takes too long as is. So these are the 5 steps in accordance with the treaty to get area-based management tools established and in power. Right? This is not too daunting. Right? And I don't think I have to sell this too much to Alaska, and just with a bit of time and encouragement, if we all band together and talk about how important this treaty is and push and ask the Senate to help pass this and ratify this and become part of this, this would be phenomenal for Alaska. With that, I'll take questions with Liz.
Could I just start out, Troy? This is Paul Fusco. Back to your last slide.
Yes, sir.
And tell us what all the letters mean down here. We don't know what all these designations are.
Oh, that might be a bit of a challenge to see. So the marine protected areas is one of the more traditional ways of establishing some meaning behind why a particular maritime area is special, ecosystem-wise, subsistence perhaps wise. There's different ways. It's one of the more traditional ways. Area-based management tools. This is the one thing. Remember, this is what I wanted you to take away from this. Area-based management tools. This is what the treaty really gives us in terms of getting something done. I forget what IFBs are. Anyone?
International frameworks and bodies.
Thank you, Liz.
So they're the other like regional fisheries management organizations, the International
Perfect.
Seabed Authority, the International Maritime Organization. Blame Canada or not, but there was a Canadian delegate who coined the term IFBs. That was taken up to sort of capture the alphabet soup of international organizations that are in the marine space.
Good. With that, we are ready for questions. I'll punt any global related ones to Liz, and I'll try to help out with any Alaska ones.
Liz and Troy, I have two questions. I'll offer them both and then retreat. The first is just to get a better understanding of the governance of the treaty and its incorporation of indigenous peoples in particular, but Troy, you outlined the importance, particularly of the executive order detailing the U.S. Response, but in a more general sense, incorporating indigenous knowledge is different than making sure that there are people at the table. Yep. And so understanding the governance, that's question one. The second actually is generated by our discussion yesterday of one of the main reasons for the U.S. failure so far to ratify UNCLOS, which is Article 11, and the idea of resource sharing, royalty sharing in particular. And I note that one of the features of BB&J is, again, the sharing of profits that come from the discovery of whatever. Does that either offer, on the one hand, some model that is transferable to rethinking Article 11, or on the other hand, is this going to be a barrier for U.S. ratification as Article 11 has been for UNCLOS with the U.S.? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Liz, you want to start, please?
Sure. So with regards to indigenous people, the treaty text definitely recognizes that, as Troy mentioned, the traditional knowledge that indigenous people have about the ocean is an important piece of conservation and management of those areas that complements and sits alongside of Western scientific knowledge, and needs to be taken into account and needs to be represented to be able to holistically and fully conserve and manage these areas. So they are not represented within the decision-making framework of the treaty. The treaty is ratified by states, countries, and the decision-making is held by those states, those countries that have ratified, and become states parties, members of the treaty body. But the traditional knowledge and indigenous people is recognized throughout the treaty text. They're represented, as I mentioned earlier, in the consultation process, specifically as a stakeholder that should be consulted, encouraged to provide consultations on area-based management tools. I think that could come up through their state governments, through their country government, or it could come through independently. I think that is something that will be interesting to explore moving forward. Also, there is a recognition of indigenous people should have a representation on the scientific and technical body that is set up under the treaty, and that body plays a key role in reviewing and providing recommendations on area-based management tool proposals as they come forward. So not, again, the decision-making ability, but definitely the ability to provide input and recommendations on those proposals as they move through those steps that Troy had mentioned. In terms of your second question on the resource and benefit sharing, you are correct. That has been a stumbling block for U.S. ratification of UNCLOS and also the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has a similar provision regarding benefit sharing around genetic resources on land. But this is something that the U.S. delegation and administration at the time was willing to negotiate on and around, and felt that the other provisions of the treaty were enough in the U.S.'s best interests to be able to craft the benefit sharing arrangement in a way that the U.S. could sign on to it. So the U.S. is a signatory of this treaty. They signed it, I believe, in September of 2023. So they are, and signature does signal the intent to ratify. And one of the final things that the Biden administration did was to send the treaty to Congress with its recommendation to ratify. So, and the other provision around the benefit sharing, I think, which is unique to this treaty, is that it is the benefit sharing is meant to, again, go back towards to the implementation of the objectives of the agreement. So it's not benefit sharing as in funds that countries then can utilize for other purposes. It is meant to any benefits that are shared from this agreement are meant to help those countries, particularly developing countries, in their implementation and meeting their obligations under the treaty for conservation and sustainable use.
Yeah. That was one of the takeaways is, this revenue sharing isn't a profit-making venture. BB&J and treaties and implementation are costly, and a lot of the revenue goes directly towards that, perhaps even support science and other things. It's an administrative cost anyone would have to manage. On the indigenous side for Alaska, this is where we can also lead, right? As in the past, having been part of the Arctic Council and with Dolly here as one of its leaders, one of the neat things about what we've accomplished in terms of indigenous ways of knowing and Western science in the Arctic Council is conducting what is known as co-production of knowledge. And this is pretty accepted throughout the United States public sector as a legitimate framework for how to combine both, how to understand both. In practice, it's very difficult. In the Arctic Council, it's a fairly organic process because the charter says so, and with some decades, it became much more effective than when it started. Co-production really became much more meaningful, purpose-driven, indigenous ways of knowing, leading as intended, and resulting with good products that we see today. Watching that evolution has been pretty amazing. At the university, elsewhere, co-production of knowledge, far more difficult. It's not an organic process. It's something that we have to learn, we have to recognize, and we have to operationalize in terms of our research and working together. It is an effective framework. We have experience with it. It's still a struggle in some ways because national federally funded research dollars sometimes doesn't facilitate this, but we can take this on. It is getting better. A lot of federally funded research dollars for the Arctic, for Alaska, requires this now, climate change and otherwise. So the system overall is improving, moving towards this. we have to become more comfortable with this as institutions and researchers to make this work, but we're well on our way. This could provide a meaningful way to pursue that even more. Sir?
Thanks. Last night, Betsy Baker reminded us at least a couple of times about the Convention on Straddling Stocks and Highly Migratory Species. And I couldn't help but think of that as the two of you made your excellent presentations insofar as the phenomenon of straddling would apply to biological diversity as well as tuna as highly migratory species and other fish that constitute straddling stocks. And I just wondered if you might comment, one or both of you, on a certain coincidence, but only up to a point. And that point certainly is clearly reached in terms of the limitation of the BBNJ to beyond national jurisdiction. I wondered in that regard whether that's because of an expectation the coastal state will manage and conserve biological diversity within the EEZ, and insofar as that had been demonstrated in some way and was expected, that really was beyond the scope and jurisdiction of the BBNJ. But I'm looking for a little commentary on a coincidence that only goes so far between a couple of very important concerns that don't exactly jibe when it comes to jurisdiction. Thank you.
Great question. Boundaries, jurisdiction are definitely something that we're going to learn how well the BBNJ handles. So, Liz, from your overview, how was that discussed and understood as something already as an issue globally, and what does the BBNJ sort of do to provide some tools?
Yeah, so the BBNJ agreement was really designed to fill the gaps in governance in areas beyond national jurisdiction with regards to conservation and sustainable use, less so but there is less so for, so I think this issue of straddling stocks is really important. There is a provision in the environmental impact assessments portion of the agreement that talks about where activities within national jurisdiction may have an effect on areas beyond national jurisdiction, that country would have to do an environmental impact assessment through the BBNJ process. So that is actually one way that the treaty tries to bridge activities within national jurisdiction having an effect in areas, in the high seas areas. I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there are a number of countries that have ratified the BBNJ agreement already that have expressed interest publicly about pursuing high seas marine protected areas. And many of those areas that they've identified have adjacency, so they're next to their, or ecological connectivity to their protected areas within their national waters. So I think countries are very much seeing this as a complementary tool to protections that they have domestically, and ensuring that activities in areas beyond areas in international waters don't negatively impact the health of fish stocks when they're in domestic waters.
Nice. And I think we can easily tell how that would be important to Alaska with our own species that migrate in different places, and we see that with more impact up here in the north and higher latitudes. So thanks for that, Liz.
So this is Paul Foose, and my question is about enforcement mechanisms. And we've seen with all these other treaties, it's just really, You know, who's going to actually enforce this? And we count on the flag states that the vessels are registered to do it. Of course, a lot of them are going to the flag states that will do the least amount of enforcement. So we come up with these great plans. If everybody in good faith follows them, that's great. But what if they don't? And I guess I would just ask the question, who's going to enforce? You've got a marine protected area. Who's going to enforce the fishing vessel that goes and fishes in a marine protected area on the high seas?
Much in the same way now, is having that awareness is a good start. And traditionally, Coast Guard-like agencies and insurance are the two mechanisms to affect that kind of behavior, in hopes that people behave as you would expect. But obviously there's those bad actors out there that ignore the rules. With tools like this will increase the ability to establish areas in the maritime region that need special protection. And the Marine Exchange, U.S. Coast Guard, and other agencies can be part of ensuring that activity in their jurisdictions and those within it are informed. We may have the ability now to request and require more tools for domain awareness, so we can monitor activity and see when maybe something is about to happen or vessels are about to enter an area they shouldn't. And in the end, as is usual with international treaties, if someone's going to violate that, they take on the risk of being named and shamed. Liz, anything to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just briefly to add, so there are satellite tools that already in place that in the sort of the private civil sector, such as Global Fishing Watch, which uses satellite data and VMS data and AIS data. So these are sort of fishing vessel tracking tools to really be able to see where individual vessels are going within the high seas, and also domestic waters, but in this case for the high seas. But there is a domestic example where there was a larger protected area, and what they saw is that there's an intensity of fishing around the borders of the marine protected area. So fishermen were aware of it, and when there was transgressions inside, the satellite, with analytical tools, you can also see determine whether that vessel has a likelihood of just transiting through the area or maybe conducting fishing activities. That satellite data and the tracking data is then associated with a particular boat, and then that boat, could be intercepted when it reaches port through the Port State Measures Agreement, and potential legal action or recourse could be taken there. So a lot of these, the BB&J treaty doesn't have all the tools to solve everything alone. It does work within this constellation and system of other ocean governance tools, especially on the compliance and enforcement side.
Yeah. And for Alaska and some of these tools that Liz mentioned, we don't have those up here. They don't work. Satellites do not work above certain latitudes north. And that adds to the issue, but we, as a state, we know this. Our institutions are aware of this, and we've built powerful systems and networks of other sensors to help accomplish what satellites can't, right? And by aggregating that and working with knowledge, we can come up with solutions. This is not new to us. So being part of this treaty is a good start, and if we can establish those protected areas, we can figure out what tools to use.
I'm just going to jump the line to ask a clarifying question. Liz, I'm Betsy Baker. Thanks for joining us. So the marine genetic resources provisions in the BBNJ exempt fisheries. And if you could just talk a bit generally about other exemptions in the BBNJ to fishery activity, that would be clarifying for me. Thanks.
Sure. So the the treaty is not meant to replace regional fisheries management organizations or regional seas bodies or any of the other IFBs, as we talked about earlier. Fisheries is, and the way that they characterize that in the treaty is with language that says shall not undermine these existing IFBs, but rather work in cooperation and coordination. What that means in practice is that that the BB&J is not intended to come up with fisheries management as part of their tools, right? So the fisheries management, stock assessment, total allowable catch, that is all still very much within the remit of existing fisheries bodies. What the BB&J agreement can do is designate a high seas MPA and identify management tools that regional fisheries bodies should take to be able to bring their activities in compliance with the conservation objectives of a particular marine protected area proposal. We'll see how this works in practice. It is very much a bit of an experiment, but it is, the agreement does have, that's why it has so many levers for cooperation and coordination, so that the bodies can work together. And really, we're talking about the bodies. These are countries that oftentimes are represented both within the fisheries bodies and have ratified now the BB&J agreement. It's up to those countries to decide what's important to them in that region. Is their priorities conservation? Is their priorities extractive activities? And to have a conversation about what are we trying to do for the greater health of our ocean, but also for sustainable use. It's not to exclude any use of the oceans. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to be able to ensure that the ocean remains healthy and is able to provide both fisheries resources and other resources for current and future generations.
And add to that, for Alaska, just one more category, the importance of subsistence and cultural use also, and impacts to that. Sir?
Is there any tension between the extended continental shelf process and the BB&J? For example, if you create more extended continental shelf, is there less high seas?
Sir, for UNCLOS, extended outer continental shelves, if granted, if delineated, only provides rights for what's below the seabed only. If that's my understanding. Correct, Dr. Baker?
There's also surface. Liz can answer that
Liz?
So that is correct. In the case of an extended continental shelf and the BB&J agreement, the continental shelf and a state could, you can see a scenario where a state would have interest in activities on their continental shelf, and there may be area-based management tools in the water column above that have been decided by the BB&J body. So there's I think a lot of when that how that would exactly work without that coastal state's engagement in that process is hard to imagine. I think the thinking is that any area-based management tool would be rather come from that coastal state and complement what their intentions were, what their planning was for the marine, for the extended continental shelf area. But from a legal perspective, it is possible for there to be a sort of extended continental shelf with activities and then an area-based management tool in the water column.
I guess that's an area for the BB&J to help. So if a nation state does have access to those subsurface rights, how they should behave on the surface, perhaps when accessing it, the BB&J perhaps gives us more tools on how to provide a solution for that kind of interaction. So good question. Sir?
Thanks, Liz. Troy, I'm Phil Lawler with the Juneau World Affairs Council. would ask, like we teased out a bit yesterday, with regards to UNCLOS, the obstacles and prospects for U.S. ratification of the treaty. And it's not quite clear to me, is the BBNJ in the same boat, or it sounds like we're more optimistic and for a sooner ratification by the U.S. in this case. So my question to you is, what would you envision in that regard in terms of timelines or specific actions that might need to happen to get this over the goal line, so to speak, with the U.S. Congress?
I would hope for the United States, at least for Alaska, being a leading voice and pushing for ratification. You know, we're a state because of fisheries, fish trap issues, and since then have taken the lead on many fisheries related issues. So getting the pulse of the rest of the nation will be kind of, I guess, part of the issue. I'm sure many of the other coastal states have similar concerns. I'm not sure if Liz, if you've been tracking anything or are you interacting with officials on the Hill?
So there aren't a lot of discussions around the BB&J agreement in Washington right now. It is rather low on the current priority list. But I think conversations like these are really important. Having states like Alaska and other coastal states, and really every state in the US, understand what this treaty is about and how it can benefit the US and US interests is really important. I don't think it's likely, quite honestly, that the US will ratify this agreement in time for entry into force. I just don't think there's enough time to have that conversation and debate. But, you know, similar to other agreements that the U.S. has not ratified, including UNCLOS, we, the U.S., are a very active observer in those processes and still have a lot of influence in those areas. And I think the other thing is, in terms of area-based management tools or other interests that the U.S. may have in, or states may have with these tools, is even if the U.S. is not a party to the agreement, they could work in collaboration with other states that are, other countries that are. So neighboring states or states where there's alignment of interests, and they could provide input and influence there. Perhaps that is another way that the U.S. can benefit from the treaty if it's not able and participate in the treaty, even if it's not able to ratify it for the time being.
I just want to come back to this enforcement issue again. So for a lot of these fishing operations, name and shame doesn't mean one thing to them. They could care less. So were you saying, Troy, that the U.S. Coast Guard would be doing enforcement outside of the U.S. EEZ and enforcing some of these mechanisms there? I can't imagine that.
They do have authority to do so.
Say what?
They have authority to do so. They do operate beyond the EEZ to enforce international law. If area-based management tools are important enough and we set up stuff that's detrimental to U.S. interests or Alaska interests, that could become part of their priorities perhaps. But they do operate beyond the EEZ.
Okay, I just think this really needs to be looked at.
Yeah,
We're going to do all this work of setting all this up, but how are we going to actually manage it? If we're using satellite imagery, you can see somebody there. How do you know they're not going an innocent passage through an MPA? Or they're fishing? How do you find that out? I mean, we have enough trouble patrolling our own. I mean, I think it's a good idea. I just think that aspect really needs to be looked at if you're going to actually make this an effective tool.
It's part of.
There has to be some way to enforce it, and there's going to be some concerns raised about that, I'm sure, as you go through this discussion.
For sure. The practicality of it and enforcing it, the difficulty, lack of resources. Domain awareness continues to be one of our biggest challenges security-wise. The satellites do not work up here, but we do study all the other sensors. You know, at UAF and institutions here in Alaska, we have knowledge and use real world of sensors from the seabed into space. We know this problem well. And gaining maritime domain awareness as well as others is not something new to us. And a lot of that technology exists. So we can harness the power of aggregating different sensors to get an increasingly better picture of what's happening out there. Right? That's the first step, obviously, is detecting what's going on. That's difficult up here. That's difficult for every single Arctic nation. It's a high latitude problem where satellites don't work. All right. Once we do have awareness, we can operate better. And tools like the BBNJ give us more options, especially when you have bad actors like Chinese IUU fisheries, right? You can't say for sure it's them, but for Canada, United States, even Russia, we're working to protect the Bering Sea for good reason, right? And this helps us maybe get after bad actors, so, sir.
John Dunker. I hope this isn't too tangential, but on enforcement, a lot of these questions got me thinking, what would the commander of an enforcement vessel of whatever kind do without legal advice? Some of these questions seem to point out some very complex matters of boundaries and which laws apply and which forms of enforcement are allowable and all that. But he'd be literally at sea without legal advice or a hell of a background in the law. And the current state of the Judge Advocate General's office is what compelled me to ask this question. And almost sorry to put that in anybody's head, but thank you.
No, it's a good question for us in Alaska. U.S. Coast Guard District Arctic is responsible as one of their statutory missions for enforcing international law for the United States. They know these issues before they go and operate. They study international law and interpret that for operational law purposes, right? And they always have communications, intent, some discretionary authority to conduct enforcement. They're very capable, and they do more up here in this district than anywhere else in the world. It wouldn't be easy. They would need resources. But having stronger global frameworks from which to operate legitimately can only strengthen these efforts and provide opportunities to get those more additional resources. Anything else to add, Liz?
Yeah, I think just to say that a lot of these monitoring and enforcement, monitoring compliance and enforcement tools rely on good governance, and the BB&J agreement provides a governance structure in which to raise non-compliant behavior. It doesn't have the hard enforcement tools that you all are indicating. But it does, again, this is, I think, where the relationship with other bodies, if there's illegal fishing activity that's happening, that is maybe happening within the context of another fishery, the fisheries management that's happening by one of the regional fisheries bodies, and that fishing boat and those actions can then be taken forward within the remit of those bodies. And to echo Troy, the U.S. does have a broad presence from the Coast Guard. It is not foreseen that any one nation would be policing the oceans for BB&J, non-compliance, nor is there an intent to create a global Coast Guard that would do so. It really does rely on states' capacities and other countries' capacities to monitor things that they're able to, which again goes to the benefits of the capacity building provisions in the treaty to allow other countries to also participate in enforcement.
Well, thank you, Liz. Well, I think this is all the time we have for this discussion this morning and this topic. And I'd like to ask the group in joining me to thank you, thank Liz for her participation, her expertise, and this great panel.
That was Liz Karan and Dr. Troy Bouffard discussing biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. It was recorded October 11th, 2025 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlinke-Ani as part of the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties and Their Potential for Protecting Arctic Resources and Cultures. Produced by the Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100 in collaboration with KTOO. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wastman & Associates, Ramada Inn,